cybersecurity threat landscape is increasing and changing exponentially. The pandemic has accelerated digitization worldwide, and cyber attacks and data breaches are growing in frequency and sophistication. As a CISO, it can sometimes feel impossible to know what tools and programs are available to help to secure your networks. In this next session, How to Enhance Observability, Know What You Don't Know, powered by Gigamon, you will learn about what resources a CISO needs to unlock the ideal programs for securing users on a network. Here to introduce our speakers and moderate the session is Jim Mandelbaum. Jim is a veteran security professional with Gigamon and has worked with some of the largest organizations worldwide, helping build out their secure access and visibility plans during a consistently evolving network and security landscape. Jim is a standing member of the High-Tech Criminal Investigations Association and volunteers with the police investigations for high-tech crimes. So please join me in welcoming your moderator for this next session, Jim Mandelbaum.
Kelley,
Ooh, there we go. So joining me on the stage today, old school, I've got Kelley Irwin, Chief Information Officer with the Electrical Safety Authority. I'm going to put on my glasses. I'm old. I'm going to bring out Ketan. I'm going to screw up his last name. Kapadia, Chief Executive Officer with BlokSec Technologies. And last but not least, I've got Omar Shabbir, Director of Growth for Infrastructure Ontario. So before I have a seat, we're here to talk about observability, and this is a really interesting panel we have to talk about observability. But I thought we need to level set. So I went out to the ultimate source on the internet right now. We all know I went to ChatGPT and said, what is observability? And surprisingly, I got a pretty good answer. I'm going to read this to you. Network observability refers to the ability to monitor and diagnose issues within a computer network. This includes being able to see the current state of the network as well as its historical state in order to identify and troubleshoot problems. This can be achieved through a variety of methods, such as monitoring network traffic, analyzing log data, and collecting metrics from network devices. Network observability tools and techniques are important for maintaining the reliability and performance of modern computer networks. Now, I got to say, with all the hype around ChatGPT, I thought this was a pretty good answer. But I think you're going to get some different opinions on what all is encompassed in observability today. So I'm going to have a seat, and I'm going to start by picking on Omar. We're on an observability panel. What's an agency like yours doing on an observability panel?
Well, it's a good question. I think
we got Siri responding to us. Go ahead.
It's ChatGPT versus Siri. It's head-to-head. What is Infrastructure Ontario doing here? To be honest with you, I've been getting that question in a lot of different domains and a lot of different conferences, this being my first in the cyberspace. Infrastructure Ontario is the contracting agency for the provincial government. If you want a road, a hospital, a highway, a bridge built, historically, hard assets, hard infrastructure, we figure out a way to go build it. My area, maybe the black sheep of the company a little, is focused on providing advisory services to the ministry, government. We help government solve problems. And the biggest one that I've been tackling recently is around digital infrastructure, digital identity. How does the province build, launch, and scale its first decentralized ecosystem that uses self-sovereign identity, digital credentials, and how does that overlap to create really foundational economic infrastructure that can be the rising tide that lifts all boats? How do we make it easier for businesses to transact? How do we make it easier for Ontarians to access private and public services? And how do we do it in a safe, secure, private way? So I guess to answer your question, Jim, the reason why I'm here on this panel is really to push the thinking and maybe bring forth a new perspective on something like observability. How do we change the mental models when it comes to observability when the world is moving to an increasingly decentralized and self-sovereign world? Maybe the data that we thought we had access to, we don't have access to anymore. Or maybe it comes with a different consent model that perhaps we had access to. And maybe people are becoming more aware and more educated when it comes to how their data permeates throughout the economy and throughout the system. So I'm here to maybe push the thinking a little bit and, along with my fellow panelists, really provide a compelling discussion on the future of observability. Thank you.
That's great. That's a great comment. I'd like to follow that up. You talked about some of the initiatives. You talked about some of the programs. We've had conversations, and I think I'm going to throw it over to you, to Ketan. And we've had conversations. You kind of alluded to the foundational changes we're making, and zero trust comes up in every conversation. And I think there's an overused word, that digital transformation. Everybody's sick of hearing that word by now? So we're all sick of hearing digital transformation, but now we're starting to hear zero trust a lot. So what does observability have to do with zero trust?
So let's, first of all, start with...
I've got to get you a mic.
Can you guys hear me?
Not yet.
Yeah, maybe. Can everybody hear me?
No.
No. Okay. Just talk louder. All right, I'll just talk louder. So, when we talk about zero trust, first of all, right, I think it's going back to the basics, right? I think zero trust is a word that every executive, all of us in the industry are focusing towards, right? And if you look at what's happening down south in the U.S., especially with the executive orders and also with the CISA's requirements around reporting a breach within 72 hours. So a lot of these things are sort of tying back to, hey, how can we enable and ensure we get that zero trust security? But some of it is, how do you want to achieve that, right? So I think it goes back to the fundamental of, in order for me to achieve zero trust, what do I need to ensure what I have from an asset perspective within my organization? Do I understand who my people are? Do I understand what access they have? Do I have the ability to, in real time, understand how people are using access, and do I have the right tools, policies, and processes in place to allow me to do that observability and get an understanding of where I am today from an environment perspective, where I am today from an application perspective, and then sort of take those things and tie back together from all the data you're getting, and harvesting that right data to allow you to make that informed decision as to, these are some of our gaps, these are some of our pain points, and then how can we take that data, which is the observability, now I have the visibility into it, which now allows me to sort of tie back to the 7 tenets of the zero trust principles, right, which is your authentication aspect, your authorization aspect, because all of that sort of ties back to who you are, but also ties back to the identity at the end of the day.
So you brought up something really key, and I'm going to key off of it, and if anybody else wants to chime in after. You talked about the 7 tenets. And it's interesting for those of us who live zero trust. You've got the 5 pillars, you've got the 7 tenets. When you look at the 7 tenets, and you brought up a couple key ones, right? It really starts out with identity and access management. It's understanding who has access to what they can do with it. And we've got several identity and access management, privileged access management vendors out here that can absolutely, they probably are leaning on the edge of their seat right now. That's my background, unfortunately. I got to be honest with you there. But when we start looking at taking a risk-based approach, when we start talking about looking at how machines are talking to machines, those are all critical pieces of zero trust. But what's also important, why we're going back to the observability, is if I'm building a plan around identity and least right privileges and controlling it, how do I validate that what I've done is actually being performed? And if you look at the 5th tenet on the list, it's visibility, it's observability, it's understanding, can I validate all the procedures and processes I've put in place to say, does it actually work? And then if you go to the last one, the 7th one, which is, I need to see all of my data, to your point. It doesn't do me any good if I only see a piece of it. I need to see all my data, and I need to enrich it with additional metadata enhancements so my observability tools can use it. And I think when we start looking at observability and zero trust, I think these are some pretty important takeaways, that it's always I always say trust but verify. How about we say don't trust but verify? Kelley, is there anything you want to chime in on that? I haven't thrown anything at you yet.
Yeah, Jim, I think when you talk about trusting and verifying, you're bringing in people to that equation, and we have to think about how people are using our systems and what they're putting on them that we know about and what we don't know about. So observability to me, without going Wikipedia or Google here,
ChatGPT, let's go big.
Yeah, ChatGPT, not yet. So I think monitoring is giving us data, so something that's already happened, and observability, if we use it right, can tell us patterns and what's happening before potentially there's a problem. But people can tell us why. Observability and data and all of this monitoring that we use won't always tell us why people are doing something, and that's important.
You bring up a really good point, and we always say that what we do in security is a team sport, right? So how do you get those people engaged? You're bringing that point up. How do we get people to be engaged with what we're trying to accomplish?
Yeah, I think first of all, educate them, and if you can gamify it, it's actually far more impactful than I ever thought. We did a simple thing at my organization around, malicious emails, and people can report them, and I think this is a malicious email. They click a button. And then we started sending them, thank you for reporting this, you're helping your IT team. And then we went one step further. If it truly was malicious, we sent them a second email and said, you've stopped an attack on our company, you're a hero to ESA. And people brag about it. They stop me, in the virtual hallway now, Zoom, and they'll say like, I got your email thanking me. Wow, that was awesome. And I thought this was the simplest thing I've done in 30 years in IT that got the most impact, is getting employees excited to help IT secure all of the assets that we have.
So let me ask a question, and I'll open this up to the entire panel. How has work from home, because this is the real world we live in now, folks, how has that impacted the concept around observability and network security?
Well, so I think those traditional boundaries no longer exist, and I think those traditional boundaries are already diminishing when we were adopting cloud technologies, but you still had your people within sort of the four walls, right? But with the COVID, that has completely changed the world. So now you no longer have those four walls or the perimeters to really effectively manage and kind of see what's happening within your ecosystem, right? So now people being outside of the world, there's a lot of other additional factors come into place. I think observability and the visibility of what's happening at their device level, what are they doing, how are they doing, these are additional data points, just allows you as an organization to say, how can I now harvest this data, take this data to make it effective, to really secure my organization, and obviously increase that security posture overall.
Yeah, and to add to that, maybe from a different lens, what we noticed coming from a government perspective is work from home and COVID really created a new paradigm and new demand for the types of public and private services that Ontarians were going after. It's what prompted the interest from the province to even explore digital identity and digital credentials and create an ecosystem that made it easy for people to prove they are who they say they are. We went out and we talked to thousands of Ontarians. We did a survey here, and we got all sorts of different perspectives. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to understand the drivers of adoption. What makes someone adopt a particular use case, a credential, a technology that sends them down that road of digital credentials? And what we learned was trust is by far the largest and most impactful driver of adoption. If people trust that their data will be secure, they will likely adopt. But what we also learned is value is the other side of the coin. People need to see value. They're not going to go through an effort of buying your product, signing up to your platform, downloading a government digital identity, whatever that might be. They won't do that if they don't see value and the use cases where they'll be able to do that. But what we learned is time and time again, people trade trust for value. We see it all the time. Sign up on this platform, this whatever, give us all your data. And inherently, people want to trust. They want to be trust to be the driver of adoption. But value time and time again becomes that. So to look at it from an organization's perspective on observability, that's kind of the balancing act that you're always looking to. You're trying to promote this security posture, you're trying to promote this trust posture, but at the same time, your customers, your employees that are working from home, everyone within your ecosystem will time and time again choose convenience and value over trust. So that really needs to be understood and embedded in whatever type of security posture you're looking to put forward.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I'm going to go on record. We went 19 minutes before somebody said COVID, so I'm pleased that we got through that far. I think you're hitting on a button that we kind of started with Kelley. We talked about the work from home. I think the concept, and I'm going to raise my hand first to say I'm guilty of it, that I have taken advantage of an offer or a service that's been available to me. They offered a reduced rate for a service, which means I put my corporate laptop potentially in jeopardy by a third-party service that hasn't been fully vetted. And I think what's interesting is if everybody here was being honest, we've all done it. But we also have to understand that everybody in this room is probably a little more technically savvy than the average work from home user. So we also have to understand that they're not thinking, wait, is this really somebody I should trust with my data? But more importantly, am I giving them a vector to my organization because I'm installing their software on my corporate asset? And so going back to the work from home and observability, Kelley, I'm going to throw it back to you. What are a couple things you think we can do on that work from home that people can start looking at just as a quick takeaway, something that can be done simple to try to help some of that?
Yeah, and I think there's two sides of it. We want to get the employees engaged so that they'll help as much as they can, but they're never going to do everything that we think they should do to protect the assets. And your comment is bang on. We've all done it. I've done it. You need to do something in the moment, and as you're doing it, you know you're taking a bit of a risk, and you're taking that risk with a corporate asset, and that corporate asset is potentially going to impact other people trying to do their job. And in that moment, you think it's worth it. Why is it worth it? I don't know. It goes back to the comment about value, and I think we also need to think about it's not people aren't just working from home. People are working remotely. So some of you are working here today. You're not in your home. Some of you are working when you go on vacation. You're sitting on a beach. Your thinking at that moment is probably not the best around risk. It's more around, ease and comfort and what I need to do at this moment. You're probably opening documents that you may be not opening if you were sitting at your office and you were thinking and you were working and talking to other workmates that day. So we need to have things like tools and observability to have that safety net for when people are taking those risks and they're not even thinking about it. And take it one step further. It's not just your employees using those corporate assets. Let's all be really clear. They're handing those sometimes to their 4-year-old. Here, use my phone a minute. Mommy needs to do something. I don't have little kids, but if I did, I'm sure I would be guilty of that. So we need to have the tools and the assets protect us from the human behavior when people are not using their best judgment.
So this really does, oh, my mic's off again. Can you guys hear me? Oh, there we go. So this really does go back to the whole concept of why we're here, observability, right? It really does go down to, we have to kind of accept, and I love your example here, mommy has to make a phone call. I'll take it, daddy has to make a phone call, use my iPad in the meantime, and that's potentially a corporate asset because it's connected to the corporate network. We have to really expect that's going to happen. What that means is that we need to inspect all of the traffic happening on our network, but we don't live in a single network anymore. I would be willing to bet you there's nobody in this place right now that has a single network. We all live in a hybrid world. We all live in a multi-cloud, multi-network environment. So observability changes when we start looking at hybrid cloud. And so I'm going to pose this question to you, to the panel actually. When we start talking about hybrid cloud and the shared security model, I always love the fact that the cloud providers basically say, once you put data in the cloud, that's your problem. So how do we deal with the concept that I don't live in a single cloud or a single network environment anymore. How does that shift our observability view? What are your thoughts? Who wants to take it?
So I think first of all, some of that also goes back to the context, right? Because I think it's one thing to sort of understand where you are, what are you doing, and whether if you're multi-cloud, single cloud. But I think if you can get some of the contextual data as part of your telemetry from a data perspective, that also gives you enough insights to start making those informed, intelligent decisions with the right solutioning and the tool set to allow you to drive certain things from an observability perspective, right? And some of this may go back to some of the rudimentary things we would talk about, such as user behavior analytics, right? Sort of your risk-based assessing of things as you're coming in, like you're authenticating, but then as you go through the different layers from doing your job, are you doing a risk evaluation at different steps in that flow? And then now, do I need to prompt you to reauthorize, or am I doing things behind the scenes to really ensure that, we are validating you at every step? So in this way, it doesn't matter where you're coming from, whether you're in Toronto or you're sitting somewhere in Bahamas working, or you could be at a cafe shop somewhere. But within the context, if I can get that information related to you, and if I can make those informed decisions, then obviously, removing the people factor, because, people usually tend to be the weakest link in this area. So obviously, not everything can be solved from a people perspective, but if we can make things smart enough to drive those decisions, and then make it easy for the, from an end user perspective to say, hey, you are now doing certain things which are outside of your behavior, so I'm going to now step you up to re-authenticate, reauthorize, or do something, so then I know it is you, and I'm going to let you through. So I think it's kind of, as Kelley said, it's sort of finding that right balance of technology and people to ensure we can tie those things together, and more importantly, obviously removing the friction from that, because I think the last thing we want to do is add more friction for the end users in that context, because I don't want to be authenticated every time. I don't want to be challenged every time, everything I do, but put in those right solutions to allow us to drive that effectively.
So clearly we know who the zero trust person is on the panel right now. So if you look at it, he's kind of quoting tenets 1, 2, and 3 right there. Got a little into 4. Yeah, I live it too. But he's not wrong. I agree with him completely. It's about understanding. So, you make sure you talk to your privileged access management, your identity access management, and your multi-factor, because he covered all 3 of those, the vendors out there. We don't do that. We're an observability company, so I'll stay back on that. But the point is I think he's really right on the money. I think there's some low-hanging fruit that you can take away with that. It's really getting some controls. And I think that one of the things in security, we always joke and say if we haven't pissed off our end users, we're not trying hard enough yet. But I think that there's some reality that we really do need to get some tight controls and take a risk-based approach to how we do things. But observability in a multi-cloud is a little different than just MFA. It's really being able to see it and be able to see it at the same level in each of those environments. Because if I look at my on-prem network, I have easy access to the data, right? I have access to the packets, I have access to all the logs. But when I get to the cloud, I lose some of that. So as we move in that hybrid cloud, and you guys are directing people in the hybrid cloud, what are some of the suggestions we can make to folks that are out there on how do I get parity? How do I start looking at simplification versus I have tools for the cloud, I have tools for on-prem, and oh, by the way, this cloud, I have a different set of tools. What are your thoughts? Who wants to chime in on that?
Happy to take an initial stab at it. Maybe I'll come at it from more of a macro perspective as opposed to micro for a single organization. The government has the challenge of this right now. We want to enable a digital identity and credential system, but the technology stack that this would be aligned to would limit the extent of observability that we would have, because it would be a self-sovereign model. The same way you have a wallet that has a physical card in it, you can take that card out of your wallet and put it back in your wallet, and no one knows that transaction has occurred. That is data that's not being captured in the physical world, and trying to replicate that in the digital world is the intent, to provide that level of privacy and security. So how do you create products? How does your organization create a product, customer facing, in which every time the customer uses it, you're losing so much of the data that you're typically used to collecting because it's now a self-sovereign model. So I think a lot of how you tackle that, government's dealing with this, large organizations, small organizations, everyone's dealing with this. How you tackle it is by having the rules of the road within the ecosystem established to an extent. In a multi-ecosystem environment, you really need to be able to trust that you are one element and one leg of the value chain, but there are vendors and companies and organizations before that, vendors, companies, organizations after that. Who's making the wallet? Who's making the credential? Who's receiving the data at the end of the day? All of this happens outside of your control. You just created a product and put it out there. And the only way that an organization will feel safe and comfortable in a world like that, in a decentralized world like that, is if there are rules of the road that are established, if there are common accepted norms, standards, if there's a robust framework for managing liability if things go wrong. Organizations feel comfortable. The company that makes the wallet isn't afraid that all the burden is going to fall on me if something goes wrong, or if the user inadvertently gives their data to someone and all the blame's on me all of a sudden. So establishing those rules of the road, working out in the open sourcing to the extent that you can some of this work, establishing the standards, and from government perspective, just being transparent about the rails that you're building, I think will go a long way to pushing that ecosystem along and have spillover effects into some of the specific lines of questioning that you were getting into around observability, because the reality is your organization could do everything right, but if you can't rely on someone else within that ecosystem, it could all still come crashing down.
Yeah, and I think that's where I was going earlier, which was you can build everything, but you have to verify and validate. So it's interesting is we had a countdown clock that told us how much time we have. I think we only have a few minutes left. If we use that time, we'll be up here all day. So what I want to do is I want to go to each panelist, and I want to have them give you a takeaway, because one of the things that I always like is when I leave a panel, what is a tidbit? What is something I can use, a low-hanging fruit that's actually achievable, right? Don't give you a laundry list of 50 things. What can you walk out of here and start investigating, start thinking about, or try to implement? So I'm going to start down on the end. Kelley, what is something that you think that the folks here in the room can take away that is an actionable, potentially low-hanging fruit?
Yeah, and so I'll take it, again, not to the technical side, because I think everyone in this room has a lot of information about tools and technologies and monitoring and things that they can do that they're already exploring. But talk to people, talk to your employees and talk to your stakeholders, whether that's customers, but external people who use your systems, and think about what is the worst thing that you're worried about, and then ask them their behavior in using that. And I'll give you a really simple example that today will sound like nonsense, but happened in a major corporation that I worked at. Our infrastructure leader decided one day the biggest thing he was worried about was USB fobs going in the laptops and infecting his network, and he was not wrong for being worried. So he overnight said no USBs, and he locked down all laptops so no one could put their USB into their laptop. Sounds good. Okay. What happened the very next day? People started emailing files from their work email to their personal email so they could give it to the person that they needed to give it to, because they could no longer use the USB key. So he didn't think through, why are people doing this? He didn't talk to anyone. There seems to be a lot of traffic of data going into these USBs and being transported out of the company. Why are you doing that? He could have given them a wonderful solution of how to transport that data. He didn't do it. So he made a worse security risk to the company than he had the day before. So talk to people about the thing you're worried about and find out why their behavior is that way.
I like that.
So just to add on to Kelley's people, right? So there's people, process, technology, right? So yes, technology can solve some problems, but again, you have to tie the three together in order for it to effectively work. And I think also, think about quick wins. Often organizations take on these massive initiatives, multi-year initiatives, but then they wait for like 2 years, right? And I always say, especially when we look at organizations, I think there was just a report out not too long ago where only 15% of organizations globally have the maturity from a zero trust perspective, right? So again, think about those baby steps. You'll eventually get there. It's a journey, right? So take one step at a time as you go through that journey.
Bite-sized chunks. I like it.
Yeah, well said. Both great suggestions. I guess staying on brand and future-looking, maybe what I'll say is think about your organization, think about your products, your customers, your platforms. Think about the data that currently you have built processes, and it's all predicated on access to certain types of data. And then think about a world when if you don't have access to that data anymore. What does that look like? What's your customer-facing resolution to something like that? What if the demands of your customers, your vendors, your employees all of a sudden changes, and people want less data sharing? People want greater consent models overlaid on top of that. Think about a world when you don't have that data anymore. How do you adapt? How do you adapt your processes? How do you adapt observability? How do you adapt everything that you need to do as an organization to continue to function? Because maybe a paradigm shift is coming. Maybe it's not going to be overnight, and it's not going to be, like the USB key change or anything like that. But I think over time, we're starting to see this. So maybe my tidbit is to go away and do some thinking on that and how it might affect your organization.
So the really interesting different points of view. As I told you, we would all have different points of views, and I'm going to wrap it back down to the crux of what we're talking about, observability. I think everybody in this room, as Ketan said, is a different place in maturity, whether we're talking a maturity in security, whether we're talking maturity in hybrid cloud, multi-cloud environment. Everybody in this room is at a different stage. But there is one thing in common that every one of us have. We're sick of tool sprawl. We're sick of spending money on stuff that's not getting us return on value. So what I would say is it's time we start holding vendors accountable. And I'm a vendor, so I'm okay with this. I think we start looking at where we are in our journey. I think we start talking to our vendors and saying, where are you on the journey? Does it align? So that what I can start doing is I can start getting common tooling, common solutions across all of my different environments. So I really do need, as Ketan was saying, when we talk about the tenets of zero trust, the visibility. I need to be able to see everything throughout my networks. And I need to be able to have my vendors that are on board with that. So if I have a vendor that I'm using for observability in the cloud, but a different vendor I'm using on-prem, I personally don't want to manage that. And I think that you probably are on that too. So talk to your vendors, leverage your vendors, get them on board with you. And if your vendor isn't on board, it might be time to look at another vendor. Again, there's probably a lot of them out there that are holding up their hand and saying, me. But I think that what we need to step back from is to understand, as I'm moving to these clouds, what tooling do I have? Can I repurpose? What tooling makes sense? Does it make sense to look at different tooling that can handle it throughout? So what, my takeaway to each of you is look at your tooling and say what makes sense near term and long term. And if the near term doesn't make sense long term, start rethinking it. That's my takeaway. So I want to thank everybody here today and thank you all for coming. That is our time. Thank you.
Thank you.